My mother lifted her wine glass, smiled at the long candlelit table, and said, "This is Madeline. She helps out around the house. Think of her as the maid tonight." 24 relatives laughed. My brother laughed the loudest. Someone near the far end even turned to look at me with that polite little smile people use when they think they finally understand your place. I was standing there in a black dress I had paid for myself, holding a tray of roasted carrots I had cooked because my mother said I was better in the kitchen than in conversation, and for one hot, endless second, nobody corrected her. Not my father, not my aunt across from him, not the cousins who had eaten my food for years and called me Sweet Maddie whenever they needed a favor. Nobody. Then a man at the far end of the table slowly set down his glass, folded his napkin once, and looked straight at my mother before he looked at me. His voice was calm. Too calm. "That's strange," he said, "because where I know her from, she's the chief operating officer." The room did not go silent all at once. It cracked into silence. A fork clinked against a plate. My cousin Ashley actually choked on her sip of sparkling cider. My mother's smile stayed in place, but only the way a Christmas ornament stays in place right before it slips off the branch. My father blinked like he had misheard. Nathan, my older brother, leaned back in his chair with this smug little grin, ready to turn it into a joke, and then he saw the man wasn't joking. I can still remember the heat from the serving dish burning through the cloth in my hand. I can still remember thinking, so this is how their story ends. Not with an apology, not with remorse, but with a witness. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? My name is Madeline Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and until that Christmas Eve in Fairfield, Connecticut, my family had spent most of my life doing one thing with astonishing consistency, shrinking me down until I barely took up any room at all. They never did. It in ways other people would call dramatic. That was part of what made it so effective. They did it with introductions, with seating charts, with jokes that landed just softly enough to sound harmless. My brother Nathan was the future of the family. I was so practical. Nathan got praise. I got tasks. Nathan got celebrated. I got included only when somebody needed an extra pair of hands. He got a brand new SUV for his 16th birthday, red ribbon and all, parked in the driveway like some kind of suburban parade float. I got my mother's old sedan at 19 with a cracked side mirror and a warning that I should be grateful because girls don't need flashy cars. Nathan went to a private university in Boston with tuition my parents somehow managed to pay without complaint. I did my first 2 years at community college, worked weekends, transferred on scholarships, and still heard my mother tell people I had taken the easier route. That was how it always worked in our house. The facts belonged to me. The narrative belonged to them. And after a while, you start to understand that surviving a family like that isn't about winning arguments. It's about learning how to hold onto the truth quietly, privately, when everyone around you keeps trying to rename it. I learned early to become useful. Useful girls got tolerated. Useful girls got to stay in the room. Useful girls didn't ask why their birthday dinners got combined with somebody else's, or why their father somehow never had time to attend their academic awards, but could drive 3 hours to watch their brother sit on a bench during lacrosse season. Useful girls folded napkins, cleared plates, smiled for photos they knew might never be printed. Useful girls learned how to read a room before they learned how to trust one. So, yes, I became observant. I became efficient. I became the person who noticed when the turkey needed 15 more minutes, when Aunt Denise was one glass away from saying something reckless, when my father's business friend was pretending to be relaxed while mentally calculating everybody's social value at the table. And maybe that is exactly why what happened that Christmas hit my family so hard. They had spent years training me to stand in the background. They just never imagined the background was where I had built my power. By the time that dinner happened, I had been living in Chicago for almost 7 years. My relatives told themselves I worked in operations, and when they said it, they always made it sound vague, temporary, administrative, as if my entire career could be summed up by a clipboard and comfortable shoes. I never corrected them, not because I was ashamed, Not because I was weak, but because I had finally learned something they never had. Not every truth deserves early access to hostile people. I worked for a hospitality technology company that had started small, expanded fast, and nearly imploded twice before we rebuilt it from the inside out. I had helped do that. Quietly at first, then officially, then unmistakably. I knew how to manage expansion, how to negotiate under pressure, how to keep investors calm and teams focused while a dozen invisible fires burned at once. I knew how to walk into a room full of men twice my age and leave with the budget I asked for. I knew how to earn respect from people who did not hand it out cheaply. But none of that existed to my family unless it could somehow benefit Nathan or flatter my parents, or fit inside the version of me they found emotionally convenient. That Christmas, I should have stayed in Chicago. I knew it before I booked the flight. I knew it when my mother texted me, "Bring something useful instead of one of those expensive hostess gifts." I knew it when Nathan called 2 days before and said, "Try not to be weird around Dad's guests this year." But guilt has a long shelf life in daughters like me, especially daughters raised to confuse loyalty with self-erasure. So I rented a car at LaGuardia, drove through freezing rain, and arrived at my parents' house with 2 homemade pies in the back seat and a knot in my chest that felt older than I was. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. White columns, red bows on the porch lights, wreath on the front door large enough to signal virtue from outer space. Inside, it smelled like cinnamon, cloves, and whatever expensive candle my mother lit whenever she wanted the house to seem warmer than it was. People were already there. Coats draped over chairs. Men talking too loudly near the fireplace. My cousins, gathered around the kitchen island, laughing in clusters that opened and closed like automatic doors. My mother saw me first and did not say hello. She looked at the pies, nodded once, and said, "Good. Put those in the pantry for now. And can you plate the appetizers? We're a little behind." That was it. No hook. No Merry Christmas. No I'm glad you made it safely. Just instruction. Assignment. Function. I wish I could tell you that was the moment I turned around and left. That I suddenly found my dignity, picked up my keys, and drove straight to a hotel on the shoreline where nobody knew my last name. But life is rarely that cinematic in the moment. In the moment, old roles come back fast. Faster than self-respect sometimes. So I set down my purse. I washed my hands. I started arranging fig jam and brie onto a wooden board while my mother floated through the kitchen in emerald silk, glowing under cabinet lights like the patron saint of curated appearances. And somewhere between slicing baguettes and refilling the water glasses, I saw him. The guest from the far end of the table. Jonathan Reeves. One of the few men in business whose silence made other executives nervous. He had met me in Chicago 6 months earlier in a conference room on the 42nd floor when everybody else had assumed I was there to take notes. He had made that mistake once. Only once. The second his eyes met mine in my parents' dining room, I knew he recognized me. I also knew my mother had no idea who she had invited into her little theater of humiliation. And for the first time that night, standing there with pomegranate seeds on my fingertips and holiday music playing too softly through hidden speakers, I had the strangest feeling. Not hope. Not yet. Something quieter. Sharper. The sense that after years of being misnamed, misread, and misused, the truth had finally walked into the room on its own. Jonathan did not speak to me right away. That was the first thing I noticed. Men like him usually did one of 2 things when they recognized me in unexpected places. They either came over too quickly, eager to prove they belonged in my orbit, or they hesitated just long enough to measure whether pretending not to know me might be more useful. Jonathan did neither. He simply gave the smallest nod from across the kitchen, as if to say, "I see you. I see exactly what this is." And then he turned back to my father, who was walking him through the house with all the proud energy of a man who believed square footage could substitute for character. I kept arranging the appetizer board. Prosciutto folded into neat ribbons. Sliced pears fanned beside the brie. Rosemary tucked in for effect because my mother liked food that looked festive even when nobody had the appetite to enjoy it. My hands stayed steady. That is one of the strange gifts a family like mine gives you. You can feel humiliated and furious and still slice fruit in perfect, even angles. You can be falling apart inside and still remember where the cocktail napkins are stored. I heard my mother's heels crossing the hardwood behind me before she spoke. Try to smile more tonight, she said, low enough that only I could hear. Jonathan Reeves is important. I looked up from the cutting board. You know who he is? She gave me a distracted glance, already reaching for a serving spoon. Of course I know who he is. Your father invited him through the chamber holiday circle. He is considering a regional investment, and apparently he likes old-fashioned family values. She said that phrase with complete sincerity. Old-fashioned family values. As if she had not just assigned me the role of household staff 10 minutes after I walked through the front door. As if she had not spent most of my adult life speaking about me in tones usually reserved for disappointing weather. So please, she went on, smoothing the front of her silk dress, do not make one of your little faces tonight. One of my little faces. I nearly laughed. That was another family specialty, reducing any visible reaction to disrespect into some kind of personal defect. If I was quiet, I was cold. If I was hurt, I was dramatic. If I defended myself, I was difficult. There was no version of me they would accept except the silent one. The useful one. The one who absorbed impact without leaving visible dents. I will do my best, I said. My mother nodded as if we had just completed a professional agreement. Good. And after dinner, I may need you to refresh the dessert plates. Then she was gone again, floating back toward the dining room where laughter rose and fell in polished little bursts. I stood there for a moment with the serving spoon still in my hand and let the familiar ache settle into place. It was never just one insult. That is what people do not understand about this kind of family. It is architecture. Every small slight supports the next one. Every joke, every correction, every exclusion is a beam in a house they have been building around you for years. By the time you are old enough to name what is happening, you are already living inside it. My brother Nathan walked in a minute later, reaching past me for a bourbon glass without asking whether he was in the way. He smelled like cedar cologne and confidence, that particular kind of confidence men get when they have been overpraised for ordinary things since childhood. You're doing the cheese board now, he said, glancing down. Wow. They really have you on theme this year. I did not answer. He leaned one shoulder against the counter and lowered his voice in that fake friendly way he used when he wanted to say something cruel without losing his smile. Just so you know, Mom is stressed. Dad is stressed. Tonight matters. So maybe do not correct anybody if they say something a little off. You always make things bigger than they need to be. I set down the knife. Doi. Yes. He took a sip of his drink. And honestly, Maddie, people are more comfortable when you are not so intense. There it was. The family word. Intense. Their favorite label for any intelligence, ambition, memory, or dignity they could not control. Nathan got to be confident. I got to be intense. Nathan was decisive. I was intimidating. Nathan was persuasive. I was too much. You should go enjoy your guests, I said. He smiled like he had won something. That is exactly what I planned to do. After he left, I pressed both palms against the cool edge of the marble counter and took one slow breath. Then another. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 6. It was a trick I had learned in conference rooms, not family kitchens, but it worked just as well. I had needed it plenty the year before, when my company nearly lost a major acquisition because one board member decided I was too young to handle integration strategy. I had sat through that meeting while 2 men interrupted me 6 separate times in 30 minutes, and I had still walked out with my plan approved and my title expanded 3 months later. That was the part my family never understood. They thought because I did not fight every insult in real time, I did not know how to fight at all. They mistook restraint for weakness, silence for surrender, distance for shame. But there is a difference between lacking power and refusing to waste it. I carried the appetizer boards into the dining room just as everyone was settling in. The table looked like something from a magazine spread curated for people who believed love could be demonstrated through expensive linens. Tall, ivory candles. Crystal glasses. Sprigs of cedar wound through the center runner. The good china with the gold rim my mother only brought out when other people were there to admire it. My father stood at the head of the table in a navy blazer, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair, as if preparing to preside over a merger instead of a family dinner. My cousins were already seated in their little tribes of marriage and obligation. Aunt Lorraine wore deep plum and watched everything with the stillness of someone who had lived long enough to stop mistaking surface for truth. When I stepped in with the appetizer tray, several conversations paused at once. Not dramatically, just enough for me to feel the shift. The old role sliding into place. Here she is, the one who serves, the one who hovers, the one who belongs to the room, but not fully to the table. Set those near the center, my mother said, not looking at me directly. I did. Jonathan Reeves was seated 3 chairs down from my father, close enough to be honored, far enough to be observed. His expression did not change when I placed the platter beside him, but I caught the faintest narrowing of his eyes. He was a man who noticed structures, chains of command, behavioral hierarchies, who deferred to whom, and who got erased while everyone else called it tradition. It occurred to me, then, that my family might be giving away far more than they realized. My father raised his glass for the pre-dinner blessing. It was not religious exactly. My parents only reached for faith when it improved the optics. It was more a toast to family, legacy, gratitude, and the blessing of gathering under one roof at Christmas. Legacy. That word nearly got stuck in my throat. In our family, legacy had always meant inheritance of importance, and importance had always moved in one direction. Toward Nathan. Toward the son. Toward the louder child, the easier child, the one who looked right in photographs and never disrupted the family brand by insisting on inconvenient truths. We are especially grateful this year, my father said, for the people who continue to show up and help keep everything running. My mother smiled at that. Nathan smirked into his glass. It was subtle, just subtle enough that anyone outside the pattern would miss it. But I did not miss it. I never missed it. The entire sentence was aimed at me, wrapped in gratitude so nobody could accuse them of cruelty. It was brilliant in a way. The kind of brilliance people mistake for manners. Dinner began in waves. The plates moved. The wine poured. The conversations separated into competing performances. My cousin Ashley wanted everyone to know she had started Pilates reformer classes. Uncle Peter wanted everyone to know the market was correcting in ways that only he had predicted. Organized. Very reliable. Reliable. Another family favorite. The kind of compliment designed to keep a woman permanently adjacent to power, never inside it. Aunt Lorraine looked at me over the rim of her glass. She knew. Of course she knew. She always knew when my mother was polishing the knife before sliding it in. Operations can mean a lot of things these days, Jonathan said. It was the first full sentence he had directed toward me all evening. My mother gave a quick laugh. In Madeline's case, it means she is happiest being helpful. I felt every muscle in my body go very still. Sometimes the worst part of a humiliation is not the words. It is the confidence behind them. The certainty that nobody will challenge the version of you being sold in real time. My father dabbed the corner of his mouth with his napkin. Nathan reached for more stuffing. Somebody at the other end of the table chuckled, as if my mother had said something witty instead of revealing exactly how little she thought of her own daughter. And then Jonathan turned toward me fully. Not toward my parents. Toward me. His voice was even, but there was something in it now. Something sharpened. That is not the impression I got. I looked up. Across the table, my mother's smile flickered for half a second. My father straightened just slightly in his chair. Nathan stopped chewing. Nobody spoke. The room had not changed yet. Not officially. But the air had. In families like mine, there is a moment before the floor gives way when everybody still believes they are standing on solid ground. And that was the moment I realized mine had no idea how close they were to the edge. For one suspended second, nobody moved. The candles kept burning. The silverware still caught the light. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer gave a soft mechanical beep that nobody answered. My mother let out a laugh first, but it came a fraction too late. "Oh," she said, waving one hand lightly. I was only teasing. Madeline knows how we are. The oldest trick in my family was this one. Say something cruel in a room full of witnesses, then dress it up as humor the moment someone with actual authority notices the blade. My father smiled the way men smile when they think they can. Still outmaneuver discomfort with charm. You know how family is, he said to Jonathan. We all give each other a hard time around the holidays. Jonathan did not smile back. He set his fork down with deliberate care. I am sure you do, he said. But where I know Madeline from, people do not confuse her role. My pulse was suddenly so loud I could hear it in my ears. Across the table, Nathan leaned forward, eager and irritated at once, like a man watching a conversation he had not prepared for. Roll, he said. I think there is probably some misunderstanding. Jonathan turned toward him. Is there? Nathan gave a short laugh. Madeline works in operations. She has always been very good at support functions. Support functions. I almost admired the consistency. Even now, even here, they could not imagine telling the truth unless it passed through a filter that made me smaller first. Jonathan looked back at me, and I realized he was giving me something my family never had. A choice. He was not exposing anything yet. Not fully. He was waiting to see whether I wanted to claim my own ground or keep the room comfortable for the people who had never once protected mine. My mother reached for her wine glass. She is very organized, she said brightly. That has always been Madeline's gift. There are moments in life when time does not exactly slow down. It sharpens. Every detail separates. I noticed the tiny chip in my cousin Ashley's nail polish as she froze with her glass halfway to her mouth. I noticed the reflection of candlelight trembling in the water goblet near my father's hand. I noticed Aunt Lorraine looking at me with that deep, still gaze that somehow held both warning and pride. And underneath all of it, I noticed something else. I was not embarrassed anymore. I was tired. Deeply, completely tired. Tired of translating myself into versions my family found acceptable. Tired of pretending their treatment of me was merely awkward instead of deliberate. Tired of acting as if the only thing at stake was dinner table tension when what they had been stealing from me for years was dignity. So I set down my napkin beside my plate and lifted my chin. There is no misunderstanding, I said. My voice came out calm. Calm enough that my mother's eyes flicked to my face in sudden alarm. Calm was dangerous in our house. Calm meant I had stopped trying to be loved and started trying to be clear. I work in operations, I said, looking first at Jonathan, then at the rest of the table. I lead operations. Jonathan gave one small nod. My father cleared his throat. Madeline, he said in that quiet warning tone he used when he wanted to remind me that his authority mattered more than my reality. This is not really the time for professional resumes. No, I said. I suppose it is not. A few relatives shifted in their seats. They could feel it now, the conversation sliding out of the safe grooves my parents usually carved for it. Nathan leaned back and crossed his arms. So, what is your title these days? He asked. He meant it as a trap. I knew that immediately. If I answered directly, he would accuse me of bragging. If I softened it, he would use that softness to erase me again. It would have worked, too. A few years earlier, it absolutely would have worked. But there is something people do not understand about women who have spent long enough being underestimated. One day, the fear of speaking finally becomes smaller than the exhaustion of staying quiet. Chief Operating Officer, I said. Nobody laughed. Nobody even breathed loudly. Nathan blinked once, then smiled like he was about to turn my life into a punchline. Chief Operating Officer of what? Before I could answer, Jonathan did. He named the company. Fully. Clearly. No hesitation. It landed in the room with more weight than I would have liked, and less than it deserved. Two of my cousins recognized the name immediately. I could see it in their faces. So did Uncle Peter, who suddenly looked as though he had misfiled me in his mind, and was scrambling to correct the error. My mother's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. That cannot be right, she said softly, and there it was. Not surprise. Not delight. Not pride. Correction. Because to my mother, Any fact that elevated me beyond the version she preferred had to be wrong on arrival. "It is right," Jonathan said. "I met her during a restructuring cycle in Chicago. She was the sharpest person in the room, which was especially notable because half the people at that table assumed she was there to take notes." A few relatives gave small, uncomfortable laughs, but Jonathan did not. They were wrong, too. I did not know whether I wanted to disappear or breathe for the first time in 10 years. The strange thing about finally being seen in front of people who have spent a lifetime overlooking you is that it does not feel triumphant at first. It feels disorienting. Like somebody has opened a window in a room you had forgotten was suffocating you. My father shifted in his seat and put on the expression he reserved for difficult clients and family crises, the one that said he was still in control even when everybody else could see that he was not. "Well," he said, "that is certainly impressive. I do not think anyone realized things had become so formal." So formal. I almost laughed then. That was his instinct. Never admit the lie. Just reframe the truth as excessive. Nathan looked at me more carefully now, as if checking whether I had always looked like this, and he had simply never bothered to notice. "You never said anything," he muttered. I met his eyes. "You never asked." Aunt Lorraine made the smallest sound into her glass. It might have been approval. It might have been relief. With her, it was often both. My mother smiled again, but this one was brittle around the edges. "Madeline has always been private," she said. "We did not want to pressure her. There are lies so polished they almost sound elegant. That was one of them." I remembered being 24 and telling my mother I had landed my first management role, only to have her say, "That is nice, sweetheart, but let us not act like you are running the company." I remembered being 28 and hearing through Aunt Lorraine that my father had told relatives I was doing some back office work in the Midwest. I remembered sending family group texts about promotions and milestones and receiving either thumbs-up reactions or silence, while Nathan's mediocre achievements got full toasts and celebratory dinners. They had not been respecting my privacy. They had been curating my invisibility. "That is generous," Jonathan said, and the precision in his voice made several people lower their eyes. "Although I would think a family would know when one of their own is leading a company through expansion." My cousin Ashley looked back and forth between my mother and me as if trying to decide which version of reality would be safest to stand near. Uncle Peter suddenly became fascinated by the cranberry sauce. My father straightened. Leading might be a strong word. It was subtle, but there was steel under it now. He could not help himself. Even here, even after hearing the title, he still needed to pull me down 1 inch, 1 notch, 1 rung. Jonathan did not blink. It is the accurate word. Something inside me settled at that. Not because a powerful man had validated me. I had earned my career long before he spoke. But because in that moment, with 24 relatives watching and my family scrambling to contain the damage, the truth was no longer trapped inside my own mouth. It had witnesses now. And witnesses change everything. My mother set down her glass. "This has all become very serious for a holiday dinner," she said, trying for lightness and missing by a mile. "Can we maybe move on and enjoy Christmas?" That would have worked too, in most families. A tidy retreat. An agreement to let discomfort dissolve into dessert and small talk. But my family had spent too many years hiding behind timing. "Not now. Not here. Do not make it awkward. Do not ruin the evening. Do not embarrass us by responding to the humiliation we already inflicted on you." Timing, in our house, was always just another word for silence. I looked around the table. At my cousins, my aunts and uncles, the men who spoke so confidently about business, the women who prided themselves on reading a room, the people who had watched me carry in food every holiday as though service were my natural setting. Then I looked at my mother. "You introduced me as the maid," I said. Nobody interrupted. So yes, it got serious. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. My mother's face changed first, not into shame exactly, but into irritation at being named accurately in public. That was always the part she hated most. Nathan stared at me as if I had broken some unspoken sibling contract by refusing to absorb one more insult for the sake of family weather. My father's jaw tightened, and Aunt Lorraine, very slowly, set her fork. down beside her plate like someone preparing at last to stop pretending she had not seen the smoke for years. Jonathan did not say another word. He did not need to. The room had finally reached the place my family had avoided my entire life. The point where everybody could see what they had been doing. And once people truly see a thing, they can never honestly call it a joke again. The silence after that was not clean. It was crowded. Crowded with embarrassment, with calculation, with all the tiny mental rearrangements people make when a family secret stops being a secret and becomes a fact sitting in the center of the table beside the mashed potatoes. My mother recovered first because she always recovered first. That was one of her gifts. Not kindness. Not honesty. Recovery. Well, she said with a bright, brittle little laugh, I think everyone is being a bit dramatic now. Dramatic. There it was again. The family solvent. The word they poured over any truth they wanted to dissolve. My father picked up his wine glass, then set it down without drinking. Nobody meant anything insulting by it, he said, his tone calm, controlled, public. If something landed badly, that is unfortunate, but surely we can all acknowledge this has been blown out of proportion. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I thought about how many years he had spent speaking in sentences like that. Sentences with no owner. No responsibility.
No apology.
Nothing ever happened in my family because somebody chose it. Things simply landed badly. People became sensitive. Holidays got tense. Pain arrived like weather, with no one accountable for the storm. It was not misunderstood, I said. It was accurate to the version of me you prefer. That was when Aunt Lorraine finally spoke. She did not raise her voice. She never had to. Thomas, she said, turning toward my father with that measured stillness that made people feel 12 years old even in middle age, do not do that. My father looked at her, startled less by the words than by the fact that she had said them in front of everybody. Do what? He asked. Aunt Lorraine folded her napkin neatly beside her plate. Do that thing where you make a pattern sound like an incident. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their glass.
She glanced
at me then, and for a brief second I felt something dangerous in my chest. Not hope exactly. Validation. The kind that arrives so late it almost hurts more than the original wound. My mother straightened in her chair. Lorraine, this is Christmas Eve. Yes, Aunt Lorraine said. And Madeline was still introduced as the maid. My cousin Ashley looked like she wanted to disappear into the centerpiece. Uncle Peter shifted and cleared his throat, as though sound itself might break the pressure in the room. Nathan rolled his eyes in that careful, dismissive way people do when they want to suggest maturity, while avoiding substance. Oh, come on, he said. Nobody thought she was literally the maid. That is not the point, Aunt Lorraine replied. Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it. He was not used to being answered like that. Very few people in the family ever challenged him directly, because from the time he was little, every room had bent around his moods. Nathan had been born smiling, blonde, broad-shouldered, easy. The kind of boy strangers called handsome before they called him anything else. My parents loved what he reflected back to them.
Ease.
Status. Familiarity. He moved through the world the way some men move through automatic doors, always expecting them to open. I had spent most of my life watching those doors close quietly behind him while I was still reaching for the handle. Then what is the point? He asked, looking annoyed now. Aunt Lorraine met his stare without blinking. The point is that this family has spent years diminishing your sister in ways all of you have learned to call normal. My mother inhaled sharply. That is absurd. Is it? Aunt Lorraine asked. Would you like examples? That was the moment the dinner table changed from uncomfortable to dangerous. Not dangerous in the way of shouting. Dangerous in the way of memory. Because memory is the one thing families like mine fear most when it belongs to someone they cannot control. My mother laughed again, but the sound was thin now. I am not going to litigate family jokes in the middle of dinner. You are right, Aunt Lorraine said. Because they were never jokes. I do not think I had ever loved her more than I did in that moment. Not because she was rescuing me. It was too late for rescue. Women like me do not reach 32 still waiting to be rescued. But there is a profound kind of mercy in being witnessed clearly, in hearing someone else name what you were taught to minimize. My father's jaw tightened. Lorraine, he said, you are making this uglier than it needs to be. No, she said softly. I am making it visible. The room held that sentence for a beat longer than anyone liked. Jonathan Reeves remained quiet, but he was watching with the expression of a man who had just realized the problem in front of him was not one rude holiday comment. It was culture. It was structure. It was a private hierarchy operating in plain sight.
He did not need to speak.
His silence had become its own kind of pressure. My mother turned toward me then, as if she could bypass the witness and reassert the old arrangement directly. Madeline, she said, and for the first time all night she used my full name with something almost like appeal in it. Surely you know we are proud of you. I could have laughed if it had not been so insulting. Proud. The word floated there between us, too polished to touch. I thought of every holiday newsletter where Nathan's promotions were paragraphs long and mine were reduced to one neat line about me being settled in Chicago. I thought of every dinner where my father asked Nathan about his plans and asked me whether I was still working too much. I thought of the year I bought my first condo, a 2-bedroom place with lake views and a mortgage I had qualified for entirely on my own, and my mother's first response was, "Are you sure you do not want to wait until you are married to buy something more feminine?" Proud was not the word for what they had been. Convenient was closer. You are proud of things you can use in conversation, I said quietly. You are not proud of me. You are comfortable when I stay small. My mother's eyes flashed, not with hurt but with offense. There is a difference. Hurt says I did not realize I caused pain. Offense says, how dare you describe me accurately where others can hear it. That is incredibly unfair, she said. Is it? I asked, and before she could answer, another memory rose in me so vividly that it felt less like recollection and more like stepping into a room I had never fully left. I was 14, standing in this same dining room in a navy choir dress after winning a statewide vocal competition. I had come home with a plaque, a scholarship invitation, and the kind of shy, stunned joy that only visits you a few times in adolescence before the world teaches you caution. Nathan had come in 20 minutes later complaining that he had not gotten enough playing time at a summer scrimmage. My father spent the next 45 minutes talking to him about discipline, coaches, potential, next steps. My plaque stayed in the entryway all night, still in the bag. Nobody asked to see it until Aunt Lorraine did. I was 17 when Nathan barely graduated a prep semester, and my parents threw him a catered backyard party because confidence matters for boys. I got a full academic scholarship the next year, and my mother told me she was proud, but maybe I should not mention the money part to relatives because it might make Nathan feel bad. I was 26 when I flew in from Chicago after closing my first major expansion project and spent the entire weekend helping host my cousin's bridal shower while my mother introduced me to guests as our daughter, who lives out there and keeps busy.
Keeps busy.
As though I were filling my days with craft fairs and errands instead of building something with my own name on it. Families like mine do not erase you in one grand act. They erase you in installments. A joke here, a smaller introduction there, a missing detail, a redirected spotlight, death by omission wrapped in good manners. You all do this, I said, not loudly but clearly enough that nobody could look away now. Not just tonight, not just one joke. You do it every time something about me does not fit the role you decided I should have. My cousin Ashley stared down at her plate. Uncle Peter looked suddenly fascinated by the candles. Nathan exhaled through his nose. This is unbelievable, he muttered. No, I said, turning to him. What is unbelievable is how easy this has been for all of you. My father stepped in then, because fathers like mine always believe the room belongs back to them eventually. Enough, he said, and the word came out clipped and final, as though authority alone could still restore the old order. We are not turning Christmas into some melodrama about childhood grievances. Childhood grievances. As if the problem were ancient and sentimental, not ongoing and precise. As if what had happened 20 minutes earlier was not part of the same lines stretching back years. Jonathan finally spoke again. And when he did, his tone was even quieter than before. With respect, he said, What happened tonight was not about childhood. My father looked at him, expression tightening. Jonathan continued. It was current,
Public.
and very revealing. No one challenged him. No one could. Because once someone from outside the family names the pattern, the walls stop working the way they used to. They are not just containing the story anymore. They are exposing it. My mother looked around the table and seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that the room she had curated so carefully had slipped out of her control. 24 relatives. Crystal glasses.
Candlelight.
Perfect china. And right there in the middle of all that polished beauty sat the one thing she could never decorate enough to hide. The truth. Aunt Lorraine reached for her water glass and spoke as calmly as if she were commenting on weather. Madeline was always going to become exactly who she is, she said. The tragedy is not that the rest of you did not notice sooner. It is that you noticed and kept trying to talk over it. My chest tightened, so suddenly I had to look down at my hands. No one had ever said it that plainly before.
Not to them.
Not where they had to hear it. My mother went very still. Nathan looked confused, then irritated, then something else he would have denied if named. Uncertainty. My father stared at the table for one long second before lifting his head again with the expression of a man recalculating risk. And in that beat, in that fragile little pause between exposure and retaliation, I understood something I should have known years earlier. My family had never needed me to fail. They had only needed me to stay untranslated. Because the moment other people understood who I really was, their entire version of me began to collapse. My father was the first one to try to put the lid back on. The evening. He lifted his glass, forced a smile that did not reach his eyes, and said, "All right. We are not going to turn this into a courtroom. It is Christmas. Let us reset." Reset. Another family word. Clean, efficient, bloodless. As if what had just happened could be folded away like a napkin and placed beside the plate. As if humiliation could be undone by changing the subject. As if truth became impolite the moment it stayed in the room longer than the people who caused it wanted. My mother latched onto it immediately. "Exactly," she said, her tone brightening by sheer force. "Dessert is in 20 minutes, and I think everyone could use something sweet." A few people gave relieved little nods. Not because they disagreed with me. Because most people prefer discomfort with frosting over honesty, with consequences. That is the thing about family gatherings. Everyone says they value truth until truth asks them to miss pie for it. Nathan leaned back in his chair and exhaled, as though the crisis had passed. He actually reached for his glass again. That tiny movement told me everything. He still believed this would settle the way it always had. Someone would smooth it over. My mother would redirect. My father would restore order. I would either get emotional and discredit myself or go quiet and save everybody else the trouble. But I had crossed some internal line already. Quiet did not feel safe anymore. It felt expensive. "No," I said. Not loudly. Just enough. My father looked at me with immediate irritation, the kind men wear when a woman fails to cooperate with the timeline they have assigned to her pain. Madeline.
No, irratat.
You do not get to reset a room you set on fire. A few heads turned sharply. Ashley looked down at her lap. Uncle Peter let out a breath through his nose. My mother's entire face changed. Not because I had insulted her. Because I had spoken in a way she could not soften into sensitivity. There are sentences that cannot be made decorative once they are said. That was one of them. "That is a very unfair choice of words," she said. "Is it?" I asked. "You introduced me as the maid in front of 24 relatives and a guest you were trying to impress. Then when someone corrected you, you called it teasing. Then when I objected, Dad called it bad timing. And now we are supposed to have dessert." My father's tone hardened. "You are being deliberately provocative." "I am being accurate." There it was again. Accuracy. It kept ruining the evening. Jonathan did not intervene this time. I noticed that. He let the family answer itself. That was smarter. Outsiders can expose a crack, but real collapse only happens when the structure starts speaking honestly about itself. Aunt Lorraine sat back in her chair, watching my parents with a kind of patient stillness that makes guilty people rush to fill silence with explanations. My mother did exactly that. I think, she said, pressing her fingers lightly to the stem of her glass, that everyone in this room knows I did not literally mean Maid. I meant that Madeline has always been helpful, especially at family events.
She knows that.
She also knows I was trying to lighten the mood. I stared at her for a moment, and something in me became very calm. Not forgiving. Not soft.
Just calm.
Because when people have lied about you long enough, there comes a point where their patterns become more useful than their excuses. Lighten the mood for who? I asked. She blinked. What? For who? I said again. For me? Because I was the one standing there holding a tray, while everyone laughed. Was it to lighten my mood? Or yours? Nobody moved. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father stepped in. You are interrogating your mother over a phrase. No, I said, looking at him now. I am asking why the phrase was available to her in the first place. That landed. I could see it land. Because that was the real question, was not it? Words like that do not appear out of nowhere. They live where they are fed. They come from habit, assumption, rehearsal. You do not introduce your adult daughter as household staff unless some part of you has grown comfortable imagining her that way. Nathan shook his head with a scoff. This is insane. You are acting like Mom called you something horrible. It was a joke about you helping. You always do this. You take one comment and build an entire moral case out of it. I turned toward him, because it is not one comment. His expression sharpened. Here we go. Yes, I said. Here we go. Since apparently nobody in this house understands patterns unless someone says them out loud. My mother glanced toward the hallway, toward the kitchen, anywhere but at me. My father stared at the table like a man trying to calculate whether public contradiction would cost him more than silence.
Good.
Let him calculate. I had spent my whole life being measured by people who never thought I might begin measuring back. When Nathan got into Fairfield Prep after his first application, I said, "You threw a dinner party. When I got a full academic scholarship, you told me not to mention the money because it might embarrass him. When he worked 6 months in commercial leasing, Dad called him a natural businessman. When I led a 7-state expansion project, Mom told Aunt Denise I was good at staying busy. When he bought a condo with help from you, it was an investment. When I bought mine on my own, it was probably because I was too independent to settle down. When he talks for 10 minutes about an idea, everyone leans in. When I answer a direct question about work, somebody changes the subject or translates me into something smaller." I looked around the table. That is the pattern. Not tonight. Every year. My cousin Ashley gave a tiny, involuntary nod before catching herself. Uncle Peter looked uncomfortable in the way people do when they recognize a truth they benefited from by not naming. Nathan laughed once, but there was no ease in it now. You really keep score, do not you? No, I said. I remember. Aunt Lorraine's mouth twitched at that. Not amusement exactly. Approval, maybe. My mother sat very still, then finally said the sentence I think she believed would restore her moral position. We did the best we could. Families like mine love that line because it pretends effort is the same as innocence. But the best you could is not a magic eraser. Plenty of damage is done by people who are trying their best to preserve the order that serves them. No, I said quietly. You did what was easiest for you. My mother's eyes flashed. That is cruel. No, I said again. Cruel was making me useful whenever guests were over, and invisible whenever praise was being handed out. My father pushed back his chair an inch, then stopped. The room felt tighter now. Hotter, somehow, despite the December cold pressing against the windows. I could hear the faint rush of the heating vents beneath the dining room sideboard. Somewhere in the house, an old floorboard creaked as one of my younger cousins moved in the hallway. Life was still happening around us. That was the surreal part. My family was breaking open in the most decorated room in the house, while Christmas music drifted faintly in from the kitchen, like a joke nobody had the energy to acknowledge. Jonathan finally spoke, but only one sentence. I think she is being very precise. My father looked at him and managed a thin smile. I am sure from your perspective this all appears quite clear. From my perspective, Jonathan said. A highly accomplished executive was publicly diminished by the people who should have known her best. That is clear, yes. There it was again. Witness. Structure. A truth said plainly by someone who had nothing to gain from saying it. My mother folded her hands in her lap. Madeline, she said, and this time her voice had changed.
Softer.
Not tender. Strategic. If you felt overlooked, I am sorry. But this does not need to become a spectacle. That sentence almost got me. Not because it was loving. Because it was so expertly crafted to make me responsible for the size of the wound instead of her responsibility for causing it. If you felt. Not if I hurt you. If you felt. A masterclass in emotional laundering. I leaned back in my chair and looked at her the way I might have looked at a difficult board member trying to renegotiate terms after the votes had already been counted. It became a spectacle, I said, when you needed an audience. The room went still again. My father shut his eyes for one brief second, then opened them. Nathan stared at me like he had never met me before. And maybe, in some real way, he had not. Because the version of me they knew had been built around compliance. This version had memory. This version had language. This version no longer seemed particularly interested in making them comfortable. Aunt Lorraine lifted her water glass and took a small sip, her eyes never leaving my mother. That, she said softly, is the first honest thing anyone has said. In the last 10 minutes. And the second she said it, I knew the evening was not going back. Not to normal. Not to tradition. Not to the old choreography where I served, they smiled, and everybody called it family. Something had shifted too far now. Not just in me. In the room. In the witnesses. In the story itself. And for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of what would happen if they could not put me back where they wanted me. For a few seconds after Aunt Lorraine said that, nobody even pretended to eat. The candles kept burning lower. The green garland running down the center of the table had started to dry from the heat, and every now and then a cedar needle slipped loose and landed soundlessly on the linen runner.
It was such a small thing.
Barely noticeable. But I remember it because that was what the evening felt like now. Carefully arranged beauty, beginning to come apart in tiny, undeniable ways. My father looked around the table and seemed to understand, finally, that this was no longer a private disagreement dressed up as holiday tension. This was exposure. Witnessed exposure. Which meant he had to choose between one of two things he hated most. Public accountability or public loss of control. He chose the third option because men like him always try for the third option first. He stood, lifted his napkin, and said in a tone meant to sound measured, I think everyone could use a break before dessert. Not a suggestion. A retreat strategy. My mother rose immediately. Yes, she said. That is probably best. Chairs scraped softly against hardwood. A few relatives stood too fast, grateful for movement, grateful for anything that looked like permission to leave the blast radius without having to admit they had just watched something real. Nathan stayed seated for half a second longer than everyone else, as if refusing to move might somehow mean he was still the center of the room. Then he stood too, muttering under his breath, Unbelievable. I remained in my chair for one extra beat after everyone started shifting. Not because I was trying to make a statement. Because I needed the stillness. Needed one clean breath before I stepped back into a house that had spent years swallowing my voice and had suddenly, impossibly, been forced to hear it. Jonathan rose on my left. He did not reach for me. He did not make a scene of solidarity. He simply inclined his head once and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, Do not let them turn clarity into embarrassment. Then he walked toward the library with my father, as though this were a business dinner that had merely taken an inconveniently honest turn. My mother disappeared into the kitchen with the brittle efficiency of someone who needed a task before emotion could touch her face. I could already imagine the sound of cabinet doors closing a little too hard, the way she would overplate dessert as if sugar and geometry could restore order. Nathan pushed past my chair and headed for the back hallway with a drink in his hand.
He did not look at me.
He did not have to. Men like my brother communicate a lot through omission. Aunt Lorraine was the last to stand. She placed one hand lightly on the back of my chair as she passed and said, Do not apologize tonight. It was not dramatic, barely more than a breath, but it went through me with the force of something I had been waiting to hear for half my life. I watched the room loosen into fragments. Cousins whispering, silverware half abandoned, half-empty wine glasses catching candlelight in uneven little pools. There is a specific sadness to the aftermath of exposure. Not because the truth was wrong, because once it is spoken, you can finally see how much effort everyone has invested in avoiding it. I stood and carried my plate toward the kitchen out of habit, then stopped halfway to the door with a kind of stunned irritation at myself. Even now, even after everything, my first instinct had been to clean up the room they had just used to diminish me. That is how deep family training goes. It does not only tell you who you are, it teaches your body what role to return to when stress hits. I set the plate down on the sideboard instead. No serving.
No cleaning.
Not tonight. The hallway outside the dining room was quieter than the table had been, but not quiet enough to feel peaceful. You could hear voices spilling from other rooms in cautious bursts. My younger cousins had been steered upstairs, which meant the adults had decided this was now mature content, as though the problem had not been maturing in front of children for years. I stepped into the small back sitting room just off the kitchen, the one with the pale blue wallpaper and the bay window overlooking the frozen yard. The snow outside was thin, more decorative than deep, a powdering over the hedges and patio stones. The kind of Christmas card snow that never quite justifies itself. I folded my arms and stared out at the backyard where my father had once built Nathan a skating rink for one very cold January and then spent the whole season telling people how involved he was as a parent. I had been the one dragging extension cords, carrying blankets, untangling hose lines. Nathan got the story. I got the labor. That memory arrived so fast and so complete that I almost laughed. It was everywhere once I stopped trying not to see it. You handled that better than most board chairs I know. I turned. Jonathan stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his expression steady.
No pity.
Thank God. I could have survived condescension from my family for decades, apparently, but pity from him in that moment might have broken something in me. That is a very specific compliment, I said. It is meant to be, he replied. He stepped into the room, but did not come too close. Professional distance. Respectful. Thoughtful. He understood containment. I should probably thank you, I said after a second. You did not have to say anything. No, he said. But I was not willing to sit there and watch that introduction stand. I looked back out the window. They will say you misunderstood the tone. I do not misunderstand hierarchy, he said. Especially when someone is using humor to enforce it. That landed harder than I expected. Maybe because it was exactly right. Humor to enforce hierarchy. Not warmth. Not personality. Control. Softened just enough to pass. You knew immediately, I said. Yes. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. I kept thinking maybe I was imagining it. Not tonight. I knew tonight. But for years before this, there were times I thought maybe I was making too much of it. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. That is usually part of the design.
I
turned toward him fully then. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim cream envelope, unsealed, with my name written across the front in dark blue ink. My stomach tightened. What is that? Something I was planning to discuss with you after the holiday, he said. Under more pleasant circumstances. He held it out, and I took it. The paper was heavy, expensive. The kind of stationery people use when what is inside changes things. Open it, he said. I slid one finger beneath the flap and unfolded the letter inside. It was brief. Formal.
direct.
An expression of intent from his firm regarding a strategic partnership with our company, contingent on leadership consultation and post-holiday review. My name was in the second paragraph. Not mentioned casually. Not copied for convenience.
Named.
Specifically. As lead executive contact for operational integration. I read that line twice. Then a third time more slowly. The room seemed to tilt in a very quiet way. My father invited you because he thought you might be useful to him, I said. Yes. And you came here already planning to work with me? Yes. I looked up. Does he know? Jonathan's mouth shifted in what might have been the beginning of a smile, if the evening had earned one. Not yet. I looked back down at the letter. There it was.
Proof. Not proof for me.
I did not need proof of my own life, but proof for a room full of people who had always treated my reality like a rumor that only counted if somebody more important repeated it. My fingers tightened slightly around the page. This is why he was asking so many questions about the company, I murmured, half to myself. He assumed proximity would give him access. I suspect your father assumes many things. I almost laughed then, and the laugh startled me because it was real. Small, tired, edged with disbelief, but real. That is one way to put it. Jonathan nodded toward the letter. For the record, that was not why I spoke up. I spoke because what happened at that table was wrong. The letter simply makes your family's mistake more expensive. I met his eyes then, and for the first time that night, I felt something other than anger and adrenaline. I felt danger of a different kind. Not the danger of being attacked. The danger of finally possessing leverage in a house that had always depended on me having none. If they find out tonight, I said slowly, this becomes something else. It may already be something else, he replied. The only question now is whether you want to control the timing. Timing. There was that word again, but from him it meant something entirely different. Not silence. Strategy.
Choice.
I looked down at the letter once more. My name. My title. My authority. Not tucked into a family anecdote or reduced to a helpful trait. Stated plainly. Operational integration would be led by Madeline Brooks. For words in that sentence mattered more to me than the deal itself at that moment. Led by Madeline Brooks. Not hidden. Not translated. Not softened for anyone's comfort. From the kitchen, I could hear my mother's laugh rise too brightly above a cluster of cousin voices. She was rebuilding the evening already, piece by piece, hoping sugar and performance might outpace consequence. From the library, I heard my father's lower voice, clipped and controlled, no doubt trying to recover whatever advantage he believed had slipped. And somewhere down the hall, Nathan opened and closed a door harder than necessary, the house giving a faint shudder around the frame. The old structure was reacting. The old structure was stressed. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. They always think they get to define what matters, I said. Jonathan's voice was calm. That usually lasts until someone else starts naming value more accurately. I held the envelope against my palm and looked back out at the dark yard. The faint snow, the cold glass reflecting my face over the black winter lawn. For the first time all evening, I did not feel like the girl carrying trays through someone else's version of the story. I felt like a woman standing at the edge of a decision. And decisions, unlike apologies, had the power to change what came next. I stood there with the envelope in my hand and felt two versions of myself pulling in opposite directions. One wanted to walk straight back into the dining room, place the letter in the center of the table beside the half-finished wine glasses and dessert forks, and let the whole house watch my parents learn in real time that the daughter they had spent years reducing was the one person in the room they should have been careful with. That version of me was not petty. At least, not entirely. She was exhausted. Exhaustion can look a lot like revenge when it finally finds language. The other version of me wanted to fold the letter back into my purse, leave before coffee, and never again give my family front row seats to anything I had built. She did not want vindication. She wanted distance. Clean, quiet distance. I had lived long enough to know both instincts made sense. What I did not know yet was which one would let me sleep afterward. Jonathan stayed near the doorway, not rushing me, not filling the air, just because silence can make other people nervous. I appreciated that more than I could say. Silence had always been weaponized in my family. It had been used to punish, to imply, to erase. But silence offered by someone who is not trying to control you feels entirely different. It feels like room. If I say nothing tonight, I said at last, turning the envelope over in my hand, they will tell themselves this was a misunderstanding. By morning it will become a story about how I overreacted, then calmed down, and how everyone moved on. Jonathan gave a small nod. Probably. And if I say something now, they will call it a spectacle. Probably. I almost smiled. You are not especially comforting. I am not trying to comfort you, he said. I am trying to respect the reality of your options. That, more than anything, steadied me. Comfort had always been the bait in my family. Be reasonable. Be gracious. Be mature. What they meant was be easier to manage. Respect was different. Respect did not ask me to become smaller for the sake of appearances. I looked down at the envelope again, at my own name written in ink neat enough to look permanent. Madeline Brooks. It is strange how often women like me spend years earning what our own families refuse to say out loud. I had negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars. I had managed teams across state lines. I had walked into rooms full of skepticism and left with budgets, authority, and the right to make final decisions. Yet one holiday table in Connecticut still had the power to make me feel 16 years old and in the way. That was what made families so dangerous. They know the original draft of your self-doubt. If I use this tonight, I said slowly, I need to be sure I am not doing it just to humiliate them. Jonathan's gaze did not shift. Do you want to humiliate them? I thought about that. Really thought about it. My mother's smile as she called me the maid. Nathan's easy contempt. My father's polished refusal to let pain belong to the person who caused it. The years of being translated downward, of having my accomplishments edited into personality traits. Helpful, organized, private, busy. Words that sounded harmless until you realized they were standing where recognition should have been. No, I said finally. I want them to stop being able to pretend. Jonathan nodded once. That is not the same thing.
No.
It was not. Humiliation is about making someone feel small. Truth is about making someone stop lying about size. The difference mattered to me. Maybe because I had lived too long on the receiving end of people who enjoyed the first and feared the second. We were interrupted by the faint sound of my mother's voice floating in from the kitchen, bright and airy in that overcorrected way she used when she was actively rebuilding a mood. I could not make out every word, but I caught enough to hear her laughing with my cousin Denise about peppermint bark and coffee service. It was already happening. The reset. The rewriting. The part where the room absorbs the shock and everyone agrees, silently, to call survival healing. I exhaled and tucked the envelope under my arm. They're smoothing it over already. Of course they are, Jonathan said. Smoothing is cheaper than repair. Something in me almost broke at that, not because it was cruel, but because it was so precise. Cheaper than repair. That was my entire family system in one sentence. A whole architecture built on polishing over fractures instead of admitting the foundation had been poured wrong. I leaned against the window seat and closed my eyes for 1 second. Just one. And in that second, memories came in a rush so orderly it almost felt like evidence being laid out on a conference table. I was 9, carrying extra folding chairs into the backyard during Nathan's birthday barbecue while my mother laughed with neighbors about how independent I was. I was 12, setting out ice for guests at a family anniversary party while my aunt asked whether Nathan was excited for soccer camp. I was 15, homesick from school, hearing my father on the phone tell someone I was the sensitive one, but Nathan had real leadership instincts. I was 21, graduating near the top of my class, and being told at dinner that we needed to keep the conversation balanced because Nathan had had a disappointing quarter. I was 29, sending my parents a photo from the opening day of our Milwaukee expansion and receiving a text back 3 hours later from my mother asking whether I could recommend a reliable dry cleaner in Chicago for one of her friends. People think hurt arrives as moments. Sometimes it arrives as repetition. Sometimes the wound is not what happened once. It is what happened, so often you stopped expecting anything else. When I opened my eyes, Jonathan was still waiting. Not impatient, just present. What happens if this partnership moves forward? I asked. Practically. He answered the way capable people do when they know facts can be kinder than reassurance. There would be a formal review after New Year's. Your company would be the operating side we interface with most directly. You would be central to integration planning. And my father? Your father has no role in that process unless you give him one. I let that settle. He has no role unless you give him one. The sentence felt almost unreal. In my family, my father had always acted like access to me was inherited, automatic, permanent. Even after I moved to Chicago. Even after I built a life none of them funded. Even after I became the thing they kept pretending I was not. He still behaved as if proximity alone entitled him to influence. But this was different. This was the adult world. The real one. The one where titles came with responsibility and responsibility came with gates. And he was not standing inside them. Madeline. I turned. Aunt Lorraine stood in the hallway, one hand resting lightly on the wood trim, her expression unreadable in the soft yellow light. Jonathan straightened, but did not leave. She noticed the envelope immediately. Of course she did. Very little escaped Aunt Lorraine. I wondered where you had gone, she said. Then her eyes moved briefly to Jonathan, and back to me. Am I interrupting? No, I said. Not at all. She stepped into the room and looked from my face to the paper in my hand. Something important? There are people who ask questions because they want access. Aunt Lorraine asked because she wanted truth. The difference matters more than most people realize. I held out the envelope to her. She did not reach for it right away. May I? Yes. She unfolded the letter carefully, read it once, then again, slower. When she lifted her eyes to mine, there was no surprise in them, only a kind of sad, steady recognition. Of course, she said softly. Of course this is where you are. My throat tightened, so suddenly I had to look away. Jonathan spoke then, not to explain, but to clarify. Her father does not yet know. Aunt Lorraine gave the smallest nod. I assumed as much. She refolded the letter and handed it back to me. And now you are deciding whether to let him find out tonight. It was not a question. I nodded. She looked toward the kitchen, where my mother's laughter rose again, thinner now, stretched at the edges by effort. Elaine is trying to put frosting over a cracked wall, she said. She has always preferred decoration to repair. I let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Apparently, that is a family specialty. Not everyone's, she said. That landed quietly, but it landed. Aunt Lorraine moved closer and lowered her voice. Madeline, listen to me carefully. You do not owe this family a performance of forgiveness. You also do not owe them the sharpest possible version of your power just because they earned it. I looked at her. Then what do I owe? She held my gaze. You owe yourself a decision you can respect tomorrow morning. For a second, the room disappeared. Not literally, but the noise of the house, the pressure of the evening, the temptation of immediate justice, all of it fell back. What remained was simple and difficult and mine. A decision I could respect tomorrow morning. Not one that would make my mother cry, or my father retreat, or Nathan finally look uncertain. Not one that would produce the cleanest dramatic payoff. One I could live with when the adrenaline left, and all that remained was who I had been in the moment I finally had leverage. Jonathan was quiet. Aunt Lorraine was quiet. Neither of them tried to steer me. Maybe that was what made the choice possible. No one in that room was trying to use me. I looked down at the envelope, then toward the hall, where the house glowed with holiday light and old expectation. Somewhere beyond that doorway, my family was gathering itself for dessert. Reassembling. Rehearsing. Betting, perhaps, that I would do what I had always done eventually. Swallow it. Smooth it. Save them from the full weight of what they had been. I slid the envelope into my purse and lifted my chin. Then I need to decide whether tonight is about punishment, I said, or about ending the lie. Aunt Lorraine's eyes held mine for one long beat. Those are not always the same thing. And that was the moment I understood the real danger of finally being seen. It was not the power itself. It was what power asks of your character once it arrives. When we stepped back into the hallway, the house had already resumed its holiday performance, but the seams were showing now. Voices were too bright. Laughter came a little too fast, then died a little too suddenly. My mother was in the kitchen arranging slices of bûche de Noël on dessert plates with the concentration of a woman trying to restore moral order through presentation. My father stood near the coffee service, speaking in a low voice to Uncle Peter and one of my older cousins, but I could tell from the stiffness in his shoulders that he was not actually conversing. He was managing optics. Nathan had stationed himself near the doorway between the dining room and the den, drink in hand, wearing the expression of someone who wanted the evening to move on without ever admitting it had cracked open. As Aunt Lorraine and I came into view, my mother glanced up first. Her eyes flicked to my purse, then to my face. She could always sense when information existed near her without belonging to her yet. That was one of the reasons she found me so difficult once I grew up. I had become unreadable in the places where she expected access. "There you are," she said, too lightly. "I was just about to send someone to find you."
Send.
Someone. Not come herself. Of course not. Even now, she preferred delegation when warmth would have required sincerity. "I needed a minute," I said. "Well." She gave a brittle smile and placed the serving knife down beside the cake plate. "I think everyone is ready to start fresh." Start fresh. I nearly admired the persistence. My family did not believe in repair. They believed in re-entry. Back to the room. Back to the script. Back to pretending the damage was merely a pause in the program. Aunt Lorraine moved past me and accepted a coffee cup from Ashley without speaking. Jonathan emerged from the library a few seconds later, buttoning his jacket with the calm precision of a man who had spent a career watching institutions reveal themselves under pressure. My father noticed him immediately and straightened by instinct. There it was again. External authority. My father had never learned how to yield to truth, but he had spent a lifetime yielding to hierarchy. "Jonathan," he said, stepping forward with a smile that looked carved rather than felt, "I hope you are not thinking of leaving before dessert." "Not yet," Jonathan said. His tone was even. Neither warm nor cold. Useful, I thought. Very useful. My mother began passing plates with renewed energy. "Madeline, could you hand these around?" The request came out smooth, almost automatic, and for half a second the room held its breath. They all heard it. The old reflex. The old role. My mother heard it too, because the second the words left her mouth, she added, "Unless you would rather sit." But the correction came too late. Something in me went very still. I did not snap. I did not glare. I simply looked at the stack of plates in her hand, then at her face. "You can ask Ashley," I said. Ashley nearly dropped the spoon she was holding. My mother blinked once, as if the sentence had arrived in the wrong language. Not because it was rude, because it was new. Daughters like me are allowed to be capable or charming or quietly accomplished, but refusal changes the weather. Refusal makes everyone notice structure. "Of course," my mother said after one beat too many. "Ashley, sweetheart?" Ashley gave a quick nod and stepped in, her cheeks pink with the particular embarrassment of someone who has just realized she has been watching an unhealthy dynamic for years and calling it family personality. I moved toward the den instead, where the men had drifted with their drinks and opinions. It was not an accident. My father always pulled the men into the den after dinner as if leather chairs and darker would somehow elevated ordinary conversation into strategy. I had been excluded from that room so often growing up that I still felt the old resistance in my body when I crossed the threshold. Boys to the den, girls to the kitchen, men to decisions, women to cleanup. It was all so subtle when people wanted it to be. That is why it lasted. Nathan saw me enter and gave a short laugh, trying on ease again now that he had an audience. "Lost on the way to the dessert plates?" he asked. A few men gave polite smiles, the kind that said they knew enough to stay out of the line of fire but not enough to refuse the script entirely. I leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and looked at him.
"No."
I just thought for once I would join the conversation instead of serving it. Uncle Peter looked at his bourbon. One of my cousins actually shifted in his chair like a schoolboy caught talking during a lecture. Nathan smirked, but it slipped at the edges. "Still in a mood, huh?" "No," I said. "Just done participating in one." My father stepped in before Nathan could answer, because of course he did. "Madeline, there is no reason to keep escalating this." "Escalating?" I asked. "That is interesting, because from where I stand, I said the truth out loud, and everyone else started calling it a problem." My father's expression sharpened. This is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes a referendum with you. That might have worked on me once. It probably had worked on me once. The old trick of making pattern recognition sound like emotional excess. But now, with Jonathan standing just behind my father and Aunt Lorraine settling into a chair near the fireplace like a woman prepared to witness every word, the trick looked smaller than it ever had before. No, I said. It becomes a referendum when people spend years acting one way in private and then panic the second someone names it in public. Nathan rolled his eyes. You are impossible. To diminish? I asked. Maybe. Silence. Thick and immediate. It was remarkable how little actual forced truth required once everyone was tired of pretending not to hear it. My mother appeared in the doorway then, carrying a tray of coffee cups with Ashley behind her. Can we not do this in front of everyone? She asked. That sentence almost made me laugh because front of everyone was exactly where she had started it. But before I could answer, Aunt Lorraine spoke from the armchair beside the fire. Elaine, that concern would be more persuasive if you had discovered it before introducing your daughter as hired help. My mother went white around the mouth. Ashley stared down at the tray. My father turned toward Lorraine with a warning in his eyes, but she had clearly passed the point of caring. Good for her. Good for me. Good for anyone who had gotten old enough to stop mistaking civility for goodness. Then, from the corner of the room, my cousin Daniel said quietly, I did think it was weird. Everyone turned. Daniel was 36, an attorney from Stamford, generally allergic to family conflict and famous for leaving gatherings before anyone got too honest. Which was precisely why his voice mattered. My mother blinked. Weird. Daniel shifted, uncomfortable already, but continued.
Yeah.
It was weird. I thought maybe I had misheard at first, but then nobody corrected it. And when Jonathan spoke up, he trailed off. Not because he lacked the words, because he had reached the edge of what family culture had trained him to say. But it was enough. One witness from outside the immediate conflict becomes unfortunate. Two becomes pattern. Aunt Lorraine gave the faintest nod. Jonathan remained silent. He did not need to rescue the moment. It was doing its own work. My father drew in a breath and turned to Daniel with the calm menace of a man who preferred discipline to discussion. I do not think you have full context. Daniel, to his credit, did not drop his gaze. Maybe not. But I have enough context to know it did not sound respectful. There it was. Another piece. Another voice. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just enough. My mother looked at me then with something like disbelief, as if she could not understand how the room had stopped arranging itself around her version of events. That was the part people like her never anticipate. They think power is permanent when really it is just repeated belief. The second repetition breaks, authority starts losing shape. My phone buzzed softly in my purse. I almost ignored it, but the timing was so strange I reached in and checked the screen. A text from Sophia Bennett, my senior vice president of field operations and one of the few people in the world who knew both how hard I worked and how little my family understood about any of it. It read, "Heard Jonathan is in Connecticut tonight. He emailed earlier. Review call confirmed for January 3rd. Also congratulations again, boss. You earned every inch of this." I stared at the message for one heartbeat, then another. The universe, apparently, had developed a sense of theatrical timing. My thumb hovered over the screen. Then I lifted my eyes and looked around the room. My father. My mother. Nathan. Ashley with a coffee tray. Daniel in uneasy honesty. Aunt Lorraine in stillness. Jonathan in patience. This, I realized, was what allies actually looked like. Not a cheering crowd. Not dramatic speeches. Just enough honest people, standing in enough truth, that the lie no longer had the room to breathe. I slipped the phone back into my purse without showing anyone. Not yet. Timing, as Jonathan had said, belonged to strategy now. And strategy, unlike family performance, required me to think one move beyond emotion. My mother drew herself up and tried one last time. "I think," she said carefully, "that tonight has suffered from a series of unfortunate assumptions." I looked at her. Really looked at her. "No," I said softly. Tonight suffered from accurate assumptions being spoken out loud for once. Another silence. Then Jonathan stepped forward just enough to set his empty coffee cup on the side table and said, in the gentlest voice I had heard from him all evening, "That is usually where real conversations begin." And in that moment, standing in the den I had spent half my childhood being excluded from, I understood something almost frightening in its clarity. I was no longer alone inside the story my family had written about me. Other people were reading it now, and they were beginning to notice the edits. My mother's face settled into that polished stillness she wore whenever control was slipping and she needed to make grace look effortless. "I think," she said, setting the coffee tray down with careful hands, "that everyone is tired and this evening has become more charged than it needed to be." My father nodded once, grateful for language that sounded mature while asking nothing of the people who had caused the damage. "Exactly," he said. "Let us end this well. End this well." There it was. The final maneuver. Not accountability. Not clarity. A respectable landing. The kind families like mine love most because it lets the people in power call themselves dignified while the person they hurt is expected to disappear into good manners. I stood near the doorway of the den with one hand resting lightly against my purse and realized something so clean it almost felt cold. If I let them steer the night now, they would survive it with their story intact. Not untouched, but intact. By tomorrow, the language would start shifting. It had been a tense moment, a misunderstanding. Jonathan had misread the tone. I had been emotional. Aunt Lorraine had made things bigger. Daniel had spoken out of turn. The facts would remain, but my parents would begin editing the meaning immediately. And if there is one thing I know how to recognize, it is an attempted rewrite. My father looked around the room and tried to gather authority back into himself. "Dessert is getting cold," he said with a smile that did not belong on his face anymore. "Why do we not all sit down and enjoy the rest of the evening?" He expected compliance. Not because he had earned it, because he had trained the room for it. People started shifting again, instinctively ready to obey the movement of the house. My mother picked up the tray. Ashley stepped back. Nathan uncrossed his arms and smirked as if relief were already entering his bloodstream. He truly believed endurance alone would save them, that if they outlasted the discomfort, the hierarchy would restore itself by habit. I reached into my purse and felt the edge of the envelope beneath my fingertips. Heavy paper. Sharp corner. A fact waiting for daylight. "No," I said. Not loud. Just clear enough to stop the room. My father's head turned first. Then my mother's. Nathan exhaled through his nose in pure irritation. "Madeline," my father said, voice tightening, "that is enough."
No, Irapa.
It is enough when the truth is actually allowed to stay in the room. My mother set the tray down again, more carefully this time. "What more do you want?" she asked, and there was the first honest question she had asked all night, though even now she asked it as if my motives were the issue. I looked at her for one long second. "I want you to stop treating my life like it only matters when somebody more important says it does." The room went quiet in a new way then. Not startled. Listening. That was the difference. Earlier they had been shocked. Now they were beginning to understand. My father drew himself up. "Nobody has done that. You introduced me as the maid," I said. "In front of everyone. And the only reason this became a problem for you is because Jonathan knew better." Nathan gave a dismissive laugh, but it was weaker now. "You are still hung up on one sentence." I turned to him.
No.
I am finally done excusing the language that made one sentence possible. He opened his mouth, then stopped.
Good.
Let him stop. Let him feel what it is like when the room no longer rushes to translate his confidence into correctness. Jonathan stood near the side table, one hand resting lightly against the back of a leather chair, saying nothing. Again, it was the smartest thing he could do. This was no longer his revelation to make. It was mine. Aunt Lorraine watched me with that same steady gaze, and Daniel had gone almost unnaturally still, the way people do when they realize they are about to witness the moment a family can no longer return to its favorite lie. My mother tried one last soft turn. "Madeline, sweetheart, we all know you have done well for yourself." Sweetheart. She had not used that word with tenderness in years. Only strategy. This is not about whether you have done well, she continued. It is about the way you are choosing to handle this. There it was. Always the same trick. Shift the spotlight from the wound to the wounded person's tone. Make reaction the scandal. Make disrespect the footnote. I took the envelope from my purse and held it in my hand, not raising it yet, just feeling the room change around the possibility of it. My father noticed first. His eyes dropped to the cream paper, then back to my face. He had the instincts of a businessman, even if he often lacked the ethics to match them. He could smell leverage. What is that? He asked. Something you should have known about me without needing it handed to you, I said. Nathan frowned. My mother looked from the envelope to Jonathan and back again, and I saw the first real crack of fear move through her expression. Not because she suddenly cared about my feelings, because she sensed a gap between the role she had assigned me and the information I was holding. Madeline, she said more sharply, what exactly are you doing? I almost smiled, ending the part where all of you get to pretend you did not understand what you were diminishing. Then I looked at the room. Every face. Family, witnesses, the people who had laughed, the people who had looked away, the people who had only just started becoming honest. Earlier tonight, I said, my mother introduced me as the maid. Not the daughter helping. Not the daughter hosting. The maid. And when Jonathan corrected her, most of you acted as if the awkward thing was not the insult. It was the correction. Nobody interrupted. So, I continued. That matters. Because it tells me everything I need to know about how this family has always valued me. My work was acceptable when it looked like service. My ambition was acceptable when it stayed abstract. My success was acceptable only as long as you could edit it down into something non-threatening. I lifted the envelope slightly. This is a letter from Jonathan's firm. A formal expression of intent regarding a strategic partnership with my company. My company's side of that process would be led by me. The silence after that was absolute. Even Nathan did not move. I unfolded the letter and read the line that mattered, slow and clear, so no one could pretend later that they had not heard it correctly. Operational integration and executive coordination will be led by Madeline Brooks. I lowered the paper. That is my role. That is my title. That is the reality you keep reducing into something decorative because the truth makes you uncomfortable. My father's face changed first, not into shame, into calculation. I watched him run through the implications in real time.
Jonathan.
The invitation. The questions in the library. The opportunity he thought he was cultivating. The daughter he had not bothered to understand suddenly standing between him and access. My mother stared at the letter as if language itself had betrayed her. Nathan let out one short breath, almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it. You are kidding. No, Jonathan said calmly from across the room. She is not. That was all he added. All he needed. My father looked at him sharply. You were planning to work directly with Madeline? Jonathan met his gaze. I already am. That sentence landed like something heavier than embarrassment. Consequence, maybe. My mother's hand moved to the edge of the tray as if she needed a surface to steady herself. Why would she not tell us? She asked, and I almost wanted to ask whether she could hear herself. Why would she not tell us? Not congratulations. Not we had no idea. Not we are proud of you. Only why was this information not made available for family use? I folded the letter again with slow hands. I did tell you things, I said. For years. Promotions.
Milestones.
Expansions. You just translated them into language that made you more comfortable. Nathan found his voice first, because of course he did. So what? You got a big title. Why are you acting like this proves some grand injustice? I turned to him. Because you spent your whole life being introduced as what you might become. I spent mine being reduced, no matter what I already was. He looked away first. Just for a second.
But I saw it.
Everyone did. My father stepped forward then, trying to reclaim ground through professionalism now that family authority had failed him. Madeline, he said, if there is a business matter here, it should be discussed privately. No, I said. Private is where this family hides accountability. Public is where you created the lie. Daniel lowered his eyes, but not out of avoidance this time. Out of recognition. Ashley was still standing near the coffee tray, pale and motionless. Aunt Lorraine sat with her hands folded, not intervening, because she understood this was no longer about being defended. It was about being heard completely. My mother's voice thinned. You are humiliating us. I looked at her and felt, strangely, no triumph at all. Only clarity.
No, I said.
I am refusing to help. You hide what you did. That was the sentence that broke something open. Not because it was dramatic, because it was exact. My father's expression hardened. You could have handled this with more discretion. You could have handled me with more respect. He had no answer for that. None of them did. The room held still around the absence. Jonathan glanced once at me, not with approval, not with surprise, but with something more useful. Confirmation. I had chosen. Not revenge. Not spectacle for its own sake. Exposure. Clean and final. The kind you cannot smooth over with dessert. My mother looked suddenly older to me then. Not fragile. Just stripped of styling. The charm had come off the behavior, and what remained was need. The need to manage appearances. The need to remain unchallenged in the very house where she had taught me, year after year, that my feelings were less important than the comfort of the people causing them. Nathan set his drink down too hard on the side table and muttered, "This is insane." Aunt Lorraine answered before I could. "No, Nathan," she said quietly. "This is overdue." And because no one contradicted her, because no one could, because the letter had given shape to what the room was already beginning to understand, the old story finally gave way. Not all at once, but enough. Enough that everyone could see it now. Enough that no one at that Christmas gathering would ever again be able to say they did not know who I was. The room did not explode after that. It contracted. That was the strange part. All evening, I had imagined that if the truth ever stood in the center of my family long enough to be undeniable, something dramatic would happen. Raised voices. Accusations. Tears sharp enough to cut the air. But that is not what truth does to people who have built their lives on appearance. It does not always make them loud. Sometimes it makes them still. Still in the way of people realizing there is no graceful route back to their preferred version of events. My father was the first to move. Of course he was. He had spent his entire life believing motion itself looked like leadership. He stepped closer, not enough to seem aggressive, just enough to imply private correction. "Madeline," he said, lowering his voice into that controlled, executive tone he saved for negotiations and disobedience. "You have made your point." I looked at him and realized how often that phrase had been used against me. You have made your point. Not I understand. Not I was wrong.
Just stop now.
Stop where the truth becomes inconvenient for the people who benefited from it. No, I said quietly. I have made the truth visible. That is different. My mother's face tightened. "This is not who you are," she said, and there was something almost desperate in the sentence, because for the first time all evening, she was not speaking to the room. She was speaking to the version of me she still believed could be summoned back by guilt. The easier daughter. The one who would hear disapproval and instinctively shrink. "No," I said again. "This is exactly who I am. You just preferred me untranslated." Nathan gave a sharp little laugh, but it sounded unstable now. "You really think you are teaching everyone some giant lesson right now?" I turned to him.
No.
I think all of you are finally having to sit with what you have been doing because it no longer benefits you to call it normal. He shook his head and looked at my father, seeking reinforcement the way he had his whole life. "Dad, seriously." My father ignored him. His attention stayed on me, which was new enough to almost feel historic. Not warm attention, not pride, but direct attention. Unfiltered. The kind he had always reserved for Nathan, for clients, for men he considered consequential. "What do you want from us?" he asked. It was the second time that question had entered the room that night, and now I heard the difference more clearly. My mother had asked it like I was asking for too much. My father asked it like he was pricing settlement. I let the envelope rest against my palm and considered him. For one fleeting second, I could have gone lower. I could have made him ask Jonathan for access and then denied it. I could have let Nathan squirm. I could have watched my mother scramble for a version of pride she had not earned. The temptation was real. Not because I am cruel, because hurt has a way of imagining symmetry. If you made me feel small, maybe you should feel it too. If you built a room where I had to earn basic recognition, maybe you should stand in that room and discover it no longer belongs to you. I understood the temptation completely, and that was exactly why I did not trust it. Aunt Lorraine's words returned to me with almost painful clarity. You do not owe them the sharpest possible version of your power just because they earned it. She was right. That is the trap, is not it? Toxic people teach you to believe power matters only when it can humiliate. But that is their religion, not mine. I had not built a career, a life, an identity outside this family, just to use it the way they would have. I had not fought my way into rooms of real consequence only to mistake leverage for character. So I took a breath and answered my father as clearly as I knew how. I do not want revenge, I said. The room shifted.
Slightly.
Almost imperceptibly. But it shifted. Nathan frowned like the sentence had ruined the script he was preparing. My mother blinked, confused. My father said nothing. Jonathan remained still near the side table, watching with that same patient focus that suggested he understood exactly how much was being decided in what I did not say next. I do not want to embarrass you, I continued. You did that to yourselves. I do not want to punish you. I am not interested in using my work to make you feel what you made me feel. I am interested in something much simpler than that. I paused. Let the silence hold. Let them lean into it for once. I want the lying to stop. My mother stared at me. Lying? Yes, I said, looking directly at her. The lying where you act proud in public only after someone important confirms I matter. The lying where my accomplishments become family assets the second they are useful to you. The lying where I am described as helpful when the truth is that I lead. The lying where I am expected to absorb disrespect and call it holiday stress. That lying. Nobody interrupted. Nobody even tried. Because the power of an accurate list is that it leaves very little room for performance. My father folded his arms. Not defensively. More like a man trying to keep himself from reaching for a tool that no longer
worked.
What exactly would that look like? He asked. Again, there it was. Transaction. Terms. Deliverables. He still needed the problem to be manageable. I almost found that sad. It would look like honesty, I said.
No revisión. No smoothing.
No calling tonight a misunderstanding. No telling relatives tomorrow that everyone was overtired. No pretending this was about my tone. And no business conversations with me that happened through family access or social pressure. That last sentence landed hardest on him. I could see it. Not because I had raised my voice. Because I had drawn a boundary in the one language he actually respected. Structure. If there is any professional conversation in the future, I said, it goes through formal channels. The same channels everyone else uses. You do not get special access to my work because you are my father. You lost the right to expect that when you chose image over respect. My mother's face changed then. Not into remorse. Into wounded disbelief. That is unbelievably cold. I looked at her and felt a kind of peace I had never known in this house. No, I said softly. Cold is introducing your daughter as the maid to entertain a room. She lowered her eyes first. Just for a second. But it happened. And something inside me, something old and sore and perpetually braced, loosened by 1 degree. Not healing. Not forgiveness. Just release from the labor of pretending she had not done exactly what she did. Nathan scoffed. So this is it? You're going to turn into some corporate stranger now and cut everyone off because of one bad joke. I turned to him with more sadness than anger.
No.
I am going to stop behaving like access to me is something this family is entitled to regardless of how you treat me. That is dramatic. No, I said. It is adult. Daniel, who had been silent for several minutes, shifted in his chair and said quietly, it actually is. Nathan looked at him as though betrayal had just changed zip codes and entered the room from an unexpected direction. But Daniel did not take it back. Good. Ashley still stood near the coffee tray, motionless, as if watching the laws of the house being rewritten in real time. Aunt Lorraine said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence had become its own kind of blessing. My father exhaled slowly. And what happens if we do not agree with your characterization of the evening? There was the last little pocket of resistance, the final refuge of men who mistake denial for dignity. I met his gaze and answered him the way I would answer a board member trying to test whether I understood my own authority. You do not have to agree with it, but you do have to understand that I will not participate in any version of this family where I am diminished for your convenience again. The room held that sentence. My mother looked suddenly tired. Not punished. Not transformed. Just tired in the way people get when a lifelong method stops working. So what now? She asked, and for the first time all evening there was no decoration in her voice.
No charm.
No performance. Just a woman standing in the wreckage of a script she had expected to hold. I thought about that. Really thought about it. Then I said the only honest thing. Now you decide whether knowing who I am changes how you treat me. And I decide what I do if it does not. My father said nothing. Nathan said nothing. My mother pressed her lips together and looked away. Outside, beyond the tall den windows, the thin Christmas snow had started falling again, faint and dry, just enough to silver the hedges and blur the edges of the patio. The house was warm. The room was bright. The coffee smelled rich. Somewhere in the kitchen, a spoon touched china with a small, ordinary sound. Everything looked like Christmas. And nothing felt like the version we had all rehearsed. Jonathan picked up his coat at last. I should head out, he said, his tone professional and calm, as if this were the natural close to the evening instead of its final turning point. He looked at me, not my parents. I will have my office send the formal review schedule after the holiday. Thank you, I said. My father opened his mouth, perhaps to salvage something, perhaps to re-enter the business layer where he felt stronger, but Jonathan had already turned. That was his last gift to me that night. He did not let my family use his presence as a bridge back into influence. He simply acknowledged the reality in the room and exited with it, intact. As the front door closed and the sound carried faintly through the house, I realized the choice had already done more than I expected. I had not scorched the room. I had not humiliated them for sport. I had done something far more difficult. I had told the truth, drawn the line, and refused to become them in order to stop them. And somehow, in that den where I had so often been an afterthought, that felt stronger than revenge ever could. After Jonathan left, the house did not know what to do with itself. That was the first thing I noticed. For years, every holiday in that house had followed an invisible blueprint. Drinks, dinner, den, dessert, careful compliments, small comparisons, polished exits. Even the tension had structure. Someone said too much. Someone laughed it off. Someone changed the subject. And by the end of the night, the people with the least power had quietly absorbed the most discomfort. But this time the pattern had snapped in a place too visible to mend in real time. My mother stood near the coffee service with one hand resting on the edge of the tray, smiling when somebody looked at her and going blank the moment they looked away. My father had retreated into the kind of silence that was not actually silence at all, but strategic withdrawal, the kind men use when they are calculating whether speaking will help or worsen the loss. Nathan disappeared into the kitchen, then the hallway, then back into the den again, drifting in tight, irritated circles like someone who had spent his entire life mistaking confidence for immunity and had just been handed his first correction. I remained where I was for a moment, feeling the room settle around the new arrangement. No one had asked me to leave. No one had ordered me upstairs the way adults do with children when the truth gets inconvenient. No one even told me to calm down anymore. That, all by itself, felt like a revolution so quiet it almost escaped notice. Aunt Lorraine rose from her chair first and crossed to me with her usual measured grace. She did not touch me right away. She simply stood beside me, looking out toward the window where the snow had started again in thin silver lines against the dark. You did not waste the moment, she said, softly. I let out a breath. I was afraid I might. No, she said. You used it. That mattered more than I could explain. So much of my life in that house had been shaped by being told I was too much whenever I responded honestly to too little. Too sensitive. Too intense. Too serious. Too ambitious. Too aware. Hearing someone describe what I had done not as overreaction but as use, as discernment, felt like somebody finally handing me the right name for my own strength. Daniel came over a minute later, coffee cup in hand, still looking like a man surprised by his own courage. For what it is worth, he said, shifting his weight once before meeting my eyes. You were right. It was not eloquent. It did not need to be. I nodded. Thank you. He glanced toward the kitchen where my mother was speaking too brightly to two cousins near the sink. I think people saw more than they usually admit. Seeing is not always the same as saying, I said. Daniel gave a rueful half smile.
No.
But tonight may have changed that. Then he stepped away, leaving me with the odd, unfamiliar sensation of support arriving not as rescue, but as confirmation. One honest sentence from the right person can do more than years of private sympathy ever will. Ashley came next, carrying an empty dessert plate she had clearly forgotten she was still holding. She looked younger than usual suddenly, though she was only 2 years younger than me. That is what happens when people lose the safety of pretending they did not notice. I am sorry, she said quietly, for laughing earlier. I did not think. Everyone laughed. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not malice but training. The same family gravity that had pulled us all into orbit around whatever made the evening easiest for the most powerful people in the room. I know, I said. She swallowed and nodded, eyes shining with embarrassment. It was still wrong. Yes, I said. It was. She took that in, then gave the smallest, most grateful nod I had ever seen, as if accountability without cruelty was a language she had not expected to hear tonight. Maybe none of us had. She moved away after that, and I watched her cross toward Aunt Lorraine instead of my mother, which felt like another tiny shift in the furniture of the family. Not visible enough for a photograph. More important than one. I did not stay much longer after that. Not because I was storming out. That would have let them call it drama. I stayed long enough to let the truth settle. Long enough for the room to understand I was not leaving in shame or being exiled for discomfort. I put on my coat in the front hall under the old brass lantern while my younger cousins drifted down the staircase in pajamas, sleepy and curious, sensing some adult weather had passed through the house without knowing its shape. My mother appeared first. Of course she did. She could never let an exit happen without trying to style it. You are leaving, she asked. The question carried so many other questions beneath it. Are you making a statement? Are you punishing me? Are you going to force me to explain this? I slid one arm into my coat and looked at her. Yes. She folded her arms lightly. Not defensive, not open, just arranged. I think it would be a mistake for this to be your last memory of the holiday. There it was. Always the same instinct. Reframe. Redirect. Package. The memory was not the problem. The behavior was. But even now she wanted to negotiate the framing before she had ever addressed the substance. Then perhaps next year should look different, I said. She opened her mouth, then closed it. My father came into the foyer behind her, slower, hands in his pockets. Without the den, the leather chairs, the audience of men, he looked almost ordinary. That startled me more than it should have. So much of his power in my life had relied on architecture, office tones, head of table angles, the right room, the right timing. Stripped of all that, he was just a man who had mistaken narrative control for parental authority. Drive carefully, he said. That was all.
No apology. No concession. No correction.
But also no command, no dismissal, no final attempt to force the evening back into his preferred shape. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. Nathan did not come to the door. That, too, was not nothing. Men like my brother avoid rooms where their dominance has been publicly downgraded. Aunt Lorraine hugged me in the foyer before I stepped outside, the kind of hug older women give when they know tenderness matters most after battle, not before. Call me tomorrow, she said. I will. And Madeline? Yes. She held my shoulders and looked at me with that same deep, unwavering gaze. Do not let them recast your clarity as cruelty overnight. I nodded. I will not. Then I stepped out into the cold. The driveway glittered with a thin, fresh layer of snow, just enough to silver the roof lines and soften the black edges of the hedges. My rental car was dusted white beneath the porch light. I stood there for 1 second with the front door still glowing warm behind me and the December air sharp in my lungs, and I had the strangest realization. I did not feel wrecked. I did not feel guilty. I felt tired, yes, deeply tired. But underneath that, something steadier had arrived. Relief, maybe. Or the first clean edge of self-respect after a lifetime of having to drag it through rooms that did not want it intact. The drive to the hotel took 20 minutes. I did not go to the airport. I was too wrung out for LaGuardia, too full of adrenaline for sleep, too aware that if I drove straight back to the city in that state, I would spend the whole trip rehearsing conversations I had no interest in having again. So I checked into a small hotel off the water in Westport, the kind with dark green shutters, soft lamps in the lobby, and a woman at the front desk who wished me Merry Christmas, with no idea that my entire interior life had just been rearranged in a house 20 miles away. My room overlooked the harbor. At night it was mostly dark, only a few dock lights scattered on the black water, like patient little truths. I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing my coat for several minutes, purse beside me, the envelope tucked inside like a witness that did not need defending anymore. Then the phone started buzzing. First Ashley. A text. I am really sorry. Then Daniel. Proud of you for saying it. Then Aunt Denise, astonishingly, with a message that read, I have thought for years they minimized you. I should have said something sooner. That one made me put the phone down for a minute. Not because it fixed anything, because it confirmed what I had always suspected and most feared at once. People had seen. They had seen. That was the grief inside it. Not that I had been invisible. That I had been visible and left unsupported for so long because naming it would have cost others their comfort. More messages followed. A cousin asking if I got back safely. Ashley again, this time saying she had never thought about how often I was given tasks while Nathan was given introductions. Daniel sending a short, almost awkward note saying that if my father tried to reframe the evening, he would not help him do it. Even Uncle Peter texted the next morning, and if you know anything about men like Uncle Peter, you know that alone counted as an atmospheric event. He wrote, Your leadership role is impressive. I should have acknowledged that sooner. It was the emotional equivalent of a solar eclipse. I read it twice just to make sure. What changed overnight was not my family entirely. That would have been too tidy, too cinematic, too easy. What changed was the social weather around them. Their version of me no longer moved uncontested through the room. It had resistance now. Witnesses now. Alternatives. And once a family loses monopoly over the story, the hierarchy begins to wobble in ways even the people inside it can feel. My mother texted late the next morning.
No apology.
Of course not. Just, I hope you made it somewhere safe. Last night got out of hand. There it was. The passive architecture again. Got out of hand. As if the evening had slipped on its own. As if no one had pushed. I stared at the screen for a long time before I answered. I am safe. Last night did not get out of hand. It got honest. She did not reply. My father waited until the following afternoon. His message was shorter. We should talk privately after the holiday. Not can we. Not if you are willing. We should. The old reflex toward access still lived in him, even now. I looked out at the winter harbor before writing back. If you would like to speak with me, you may call on Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern. That was all.
No worms. No cruelty.
Just structure. The same structure he had always respected. In everyone except me. Nathan, predictably, said nothing that night or the next day. But silence from him no longer felt like dominance. It felt like absence. A withdrawal. A sulk dressed up as indifference. And maybe that was the biggest shift of all. For the first time in our lives, his refusal to engage did not define the mood of the family. It only defined him. I sat by the hotel window on Christmas morning with room service coffee and watched a gull cut across the gray water while messages from relatives continued to arrive in little uneven waves. Some were awkward, some sincere, some transparent attempts to align themselves belatedly with the truth now that it had social backing. I could tell the difference. And for once, I did not need everyone to mean it equally. That was another new thing. I was no longer bargaining for unanimous love. I was simply observing who could stand in reality once it cost them something. By noon, the room back at my parents' house had already begun reorganizing itself around what happened. I knew it without being there. The cousins would be discussing it in the kitchen. My mother would be trying on versions of concern. My father would be quieter than usual. Nathan would be offended by the loss of ease. Aunt Lorraine, I suspected, would be pouring coffee like a queen presiding over the slow collapse of bad mythology. And somewhere inside all that, one fact would remain immovable. They knew now, not just what I did, not just my title. They knew I would no longer collaborate in my own reduction. And once a woman makes that clear, the whole family has to decide whether they actually want the real version of her or just the manageable one they lost. Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern, my father called exactly on time. That alone would have meant nothing to most people, but I had grown up in a house where punctuality was one of the ways he signaled seriousness, and seriousness was one of the ways he signaled power. When I was a child, he would make Nathan and me wait 5 extra minutes in the car before school, if one of us had been careless with time, then lecture us all the way down the driveway about discipline and standards. But in adulthood, punctuality became something else. A tone. A setting. A way of announcing that the conversation ahead would happen on his terms unless someone interrupted the design. This time, he was the one entering my schedule. That mattered. I let the phone ring once before answering. Hello. A pause. Then his voice, controlled as ever. Madeline.
No, sweetheart. No softening.
Just my name, finally used without some hidden effort to make it smaller. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Chicago, with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm beside my laptop, the lake beyond my windows flat and gray under December light. My condo felt calm in the way only hard-won spaces do. Clean lines.
Bookshelf shows.
A wool throw draped over the chair by the window. No one calling from another room for me to bring plates. No family gravity tugging me back into old choreography. Just my home. My life. My timing. You asked to speak, I said. He exhaled once, not annoyed exactly, but aware. The old habit of setting the tone had met a locked door. Yes, he said. I thought it would be better to discuss what happened without an audience. I almost smiled. You mean privately? Yes. The place you prefer difficult truths to stay. Silence. Then, that is not fair. It is accurate. There was a brief pause after that, and I could feel him recalibrating in real time. My father had always believed that if he chose his words carefully enough, he could guide a conversation away from consequence and toward an outcome he could live with. But the thing about adult daughters is that eventually we become immune to the architecture that raised us. He cleared his throat. I have had time to think, he said. And while I do not agree with every characterization you made that night, I can acknowledge that the introduction at dinner was inappropriate. I sat back in my chair and stared out toward the water. There it was. Not an apology. A partial concession wrapped in formal distance. Years ago, I would have taken that sentence like rain in a drought. I would have worked for days to turn it into evidence of love. But once you learn the difference between acknowledgement and repair, you cannot unlearn it. Inappropriate, I repeated. That is your word? It is a reasonable word. It is a safe word. His voice, sharpened by 1 degree. Madeline, I am trying here. I let the silence hold for a second. Trying to do what? Another pause. Then, more quietly, move us forward. That stopped me. Not because it was beautiful, because it was the closest he had come to honesty. My father did not call me to understand me. He called because the family system had shifted, the room had seen it happen, and he wanted to know whether there was still a bridge left to walk across. I could respect that more than the usual performance, even if it was still incomplete. Forward into what? I asked. A better relationship? He did not answer immediately. Something better than this. I looked down at my hands wrapped around the mug. Steam no longer rose from it. The coffee had gone cool while I was somewhere else in thought, which felt strangely fitting. So much of healing, I was learning, is not dramatic. It is noticing what has changed temperature and deciding whether it still serves you. Dad, I said, and even to myself the words sounded older than it used to, less pleading, more precise. You cannot move forward by talking about Christmas like it was one bad moment. That is not what I was reacting to. I was reacting to a pattern. I understand that is how you feel. I closed my eyes for one beat.
No.
That is the pattern again. You keep turning facts into my feelings, so you do not have to address the facts. He did not respond. Somewhere in the line, I could hear the faint, ambient hush of his office at home. The heavy quiet of a man standing near a desk he believes makes him more coherent. All right, he said eventually. Then tell me plainly. I took a breath. Not to steady myself. To make sure the answer I gave belonged to the woman I had become, not the daughter I had been trained to be. Plainly, I said, you and Mom spent years treating Nathan like the future and me like support staff. You praised his potential and minimized my actual life. You made him central and made me useful. You did it so consistently that when Mom introduced me as the maid, it sounded natural to both of you. That is the problem. Not one sentence. The fact that it fit. There was a long silence after that. Long enough that if I had been younger, I might have rushed in to soften it. To rescue him from discomfort. To rescue myself from being the cause of it. But women do not heal by interrupting their own clarity. Finally, he said, quietly, I did not realize it had become that visible. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say about our family. Not I did not do it. Not you are wrong. Just I did not realize it had become that visible. Meaning he knew some version of it existed. He had simply counted on the structure holding. Visible to who? I asked. Everyone else? Or you? He let out a slow breath. Probably both. I leaned back and looked around my kitchen. Morning light across the counter. A bowl of clementinas near the stove. My calendar open on the laptop beside me, filled with meetings, strategy reviews, deadlines, flights, real decisions, real stakes. A full life. A life I had built while my family kept trying to narrate me as background. Do you know what hurt the most? I asked. He did not answer, so I did. It was not that Mom said it. It was that nobody at that table looked surprised. He said my name then. Quietly. Not as a command. Not as a warning. Just my name. Madeline. I waited. I am sorry for that. I did not speak for a moment. Neither did he. I had spent enough years aching for those words to know exactly how dangerous they can be when they finally arrive. People think apologies automatically heal. They do not. Sometimes they simply reveal how long you survived without one. Thank you, I said at last, because the sentence mattered. It did. But gratitude is not the same thing as surrender. That does not erase the pattern. I know. Another pause. Then, your mother is having a harder time with this.
Of course she was.
Not because she felt worst. Because she had lost narrative control in front of witnesses. Is she sorry? I asked. The line went quiet again. She says she did not mean it the way it sounded. I looked out at the lake and let the winter light flatten the horizon. That is not the same question. He did not argue. Interesting. No, he said after a moment. It is not. We sat in that truth together, miles apart. It was not tenderness. It was not reconciliation. But it was more real than most conversations we had ever had. Here is what happens now, I said. We can have a relationship, but not the old one. Not one where I absorb disrespect, so everyone else can stay comfortable. Not one where access to my work is assumed because we share a last name. Not one where my boundaries are called cold because they inconvenience family habits. Understood, he said, and I could tell by the speed of it that he meant understood strategically, not yet emotionally. That was fine. Emotional understanding had never been his first language. Structure was. So I kept speaking in it. If Mom wants to talk to me, she can call. I am not doing group cleanup. I am not attending some family lunch, so everyone can act cheerful around the issue. And Nathan does not get to bait me into pretending nothing happened. His voice stayed level. That seems clear. It is meant to be. A beat passed. Then, to my surprise, he said, "For what it is worth, Jonathan called me yesterday." I went still. Why? To confirm next steps. And to make one thing very clear. My fingers tightened around the mug. Which was? My father's voice shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something I had almost never heard directed toward me. Respect edged with caution. That the only reason his firm remained interested in any conversation near this family after Christmas is because of your professionalism. I said nothing. He continued. He was very explicit. I let that settle through me slowly, like warmth returning to a room 1 degree at a time. Not because I needed Jonathan's praise, but because my father had heard it, had to repeat it, had to place it, with his own mouth, where he once would have buried it under softer words. "I see," I said. "So do I," he replied, and for the first time in my life, I believed he meant it. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to know the old arrangement was gone. After we hung up, I did not cry. That surprised me a little. I stood in my kitchen and rinsed the cold coffee from my mug and opened the curtains wider and answered 3 work emails about the January review call. Normal things. Useful things. The kind of things that remind you life continues after revelation, and sometimes continuation is its own form of victory. My mother called 2 days later. The conversation was harder. Less clean. She circled, defended, softened, restyled. At one point, she actually said, "I thought calling you helpful was a compliment," and I told her, gently but without rescuing her, "It is when it is true and complete, not when it is used to hide leadership." She cried a little. Real tears, I think, or partly real. With women like my mother, truth and performance often shared a border. But even then, I did not become cruel. I did not list every wound. I did not force her to kneel before them. I simply kept returning to the same thing. I am not asking you to feel guilty forever. I am asking you to stop doing it. That was the line I held. Not punishment.
Change.
Nathan did not call until January, and when he did, he opened with, "So, I guess you are famous now." I almost ended the conversation there, but I stayed long enough to say, "No, I am visible. That is different." He laughed, uncomfortable. I let the silence sit until he stopped. Then I added, "You can have a sister or an audience. You do not get both anymore." He did not know what to do with that. I think part of him never will. The January review call went well. Sophia joined from Denver. Jonathan led with the agenda, not sentiment. My team was sharp.
Prepared. Unmistakably mine.
And as I listened to the cadence of people who knew how to work, who respected clarity because it made things stronger rather than because it made them look good, I had one of those quiet, private realizations that change your life more permanently than any dramatic scene ever could. My family had spent years making me feel as though I was asking for too much when what I actually wanted was basic recognition. In the real world, among people who understood value, I had never been too much. I had been exact, capable, necessary. By the time February came, the family system had not transformed into some glossy picture of healing. That would have been dishonest.
My
mother still overperformed warmth when relatives were present. My father still preferred structure to emotional fluency. Nathan still struggled any time the room did not bend around him. But the axis had shifted. They knew I would leave a conversation if it became diminishing. They knew my work was not theirs to borrow socially. They knew relatives had seen enough to stop laughing automatically at my expense. Most of all, they knew I no longer needed their version of me in order to know who I was. That was the part that changed everything. Not the title, not the letter, not even the Christmas dinner that finally broke the spell. It was what came after. The day I stopped bringing my worth to their table and waiting for them to serve it back to me correctly. These days, when people ask about family, I answer honestly but briefly. I do not perform bitterness. I do not perform false harmony either. I say I come from complicated people, and I learned early how to build my own stability. That is true. On my dining table now, in my condo overlooking Lake Michigan, there is a long oak surface I bought after my second bonus as Chief Operating Officer. It seats 8 comfortably. 10 if the people are good, and the food is generous. I host often. Friends.
Colleagues.
Sophia when she is in town. Aunt Lorraine twice a year. Always in the chair by the window, always pretending she does not notice how much I make on purpose because I still remember what it means to feed people without being mistaken for the help. When I set that table, I do it slowly. Linen napkins. Warm plates. Candles if it is cold out. Music low enough for conversation. Not because beauty fixes anything. Because creating a room where no one has to earn their dignity feels like the purest kind of healing I know. My family's table taught me what happens when love is confused with hierarchy. Mine reminds me what happens when respect enters the room first. And that, more than any public correction, more than any title spoken aloud in front of witnesses, is the reason I know I won. I did not need a seat at their table anymore. I built my own.